Happy Friday, everybody, and welcome to GeoHug. So I'm thrilled to have John Sykes joining us today. He'll be taking us through his PhD story that he's been working on at the University of Western Australia since 2013. So I'm so excited to hear this one. Thank you so much, John, for joining us.
Thanks everyone for coming along. I can see, as well as some of the GeoHug regulars, a few people who are involved in the scenarios and things. So that's great to see you all here as well. So one thing I want to do is kind of sort of start by saying that something that's a little bit different about my work is that, like most geology, I'm not going to be talking too much about data. I'm mainly going to be talking about stories and sort of how that eventually leads into sort of better data collection. And you can see there's a designer online kind of created this nice sort of artsy graphic of the different sort of shapes of storylines. And this was in perhaps some kind of link to my work. This was his Kurt Vonnegut's failed thesis in anthropology, I think. But he sort of identified different sort of shapes of stories that you sort of see across all books. And one of his is Cinderella and the New Testament, which is kind of like obviously the New Testament is a resurrection storyline, and Cinderella is kind of a resurrection storyline as well. So that's where he got this thinking from. And to go into sort of a geological theme, we're familiar with these, storylines. The classic one for your geodisaster is the man in a hole, and it usually is a man, a leading man, be it sort of Pierce Brosnan or The Rock or whoever, Tommy Lee Jones, Bruce Willis. There is the slightly more extreme version of the man in the hole storyline, which is the Old Testament storyline, another common one in the sort of geology saga. In fact, in these, there are often quite literally biblical floods, in case you couldn't work out which the storyline was. And we do occasionally get, I argue Twister is a bit boy meets girl, but that's a different subject. But why are these storylines important? You'll sort of see as we go through this, but it's the link between the sort of man in the hole storyline and geodisasters is not entirely irrelevant. So my PhD is another man in a hole storyline as well, and this is what I'm going to take you through today. So just as a sort of the origin story, why did I get involved in all this? I mean, I am notionally a geologist. I have a couple of geology degrees from pretty good universities. I should, in theory, be able to identify rocks. But I've only ever really worked as a sort of an economist and a strategist. And the word for what I do now sometimes is futurist, which I hate because it just sounds awful, but that's what people use. So how did I get into that rather than geology? I guess it's sort of, I used to have to explain this a lot more, but then last year COVID happened and now everybody gets why we're interested in this kind of subject of the uncertainty. So obviously COVID happened, stealing from the Economist headlines here, and now everybody's also sort of thinking about like the next catastrophe. So we're in a phase of sort of thinking about long-term major risks for a change rather than sort of not thinking about that. And I suppose, without wanting to make the world's problems sort of all about me, the sort of the key events when I think back to when I was growing up, I was just finishing high school when September the 11th happened. I was at university in London for the London bombings. The Boxing Day tsunami in 2004 partly inspired me to actually go do a master's in geophysical hazards. And then having not been able to get a job in that, my first graduate job in sort of mineral economics in London, basically I walked straight into the global financial crisis there. So that these were sort of, I'm sure there were formative events for people of all ages, but I guess people of my sort of age, these are things that I think stick in our minds and sort of shape our sort of the frame which we see the world. And the work I was doing at that time as well, I was working for a company called Crew, which does sort of mineral economics, sort of price forecasting. I worked in the copper team. They did all the different metals and minerals. Some of you might even have bought their products and things. This chart here is, they'll probably shoot me for showing this, but it's the track record of the forecasts during the period just before, just after, and while I worked at Crew. I mean, in fact, if you really want to know, I think I started about Q4 2007 and left about Q1 2010. So that big dip, and you can see the challenge of making forecasts in that environment. For obvious reasons, they were often not right. And there's a sort of a tendency as well, what you tend to see with the forecasts, when things are sort of over forecast, when people say prices are going to be prices are going to be high and they turn out not to be, that tends to be the sort of over optimism of the economists. And then when people say prices are going to be lower and they turn out to be higher, as we've seen a lot over the last sort of decade or so, that tends to be the fault of the sort of the geologists and the engineers, in which we're over optimistic about how much supply is going to come on stream and sort of meet that demand, and our optimism turns out to be wrong. There's less supply than expected, and you end up with higher prices. So this was sort of, again, the kind of things that were sort of, obviously there was bigger, far more major uncertainties going on in the world, but these were the sort of ones that were concerning me. I was doing a lot of work on mine projects. I did a great piece of analysis back in 2008 that showed that over the last few years, on average, the average copper mine project was delayed by 1 year per year, i.e. doesn't move forward at all. And that there was all sorts of, delays with these projects. I then went to work in some other fields. I saw the same kind of problem in the rare earths industry of these projects not being developed and moving forward. And I'm not picking on Australia here with these three projects. They are all Australian. It was just the focus of analysis at the time, but classically long development timeframes of these projects, and only one of them is in production still. And even working in the tin industry, these are sort of forecasts made, some made in 2010, some made in 2013. And even when you get 3 goes at making the forecast, you still often don't get it right, particularly this one around 2013. The price ended up being lower than even our lowest expected forecast, right? So this is the kind of thing, this sort of forward-looking work, is it, why is this so hard? Why are mine, and secondary to that, why are mine projects not coming on stream? What's going on here? So that was kind of the subject that interested me. So this is why I ended up moving to Australia and undertaking a PhD. So my sort of, I wanted to understand kind of, how do we sort of move copper projects along? What's going on in that industry? So my sort of original hypothesis was kind of based on the work that I'd done at Crew. I'd noticed that there was sort of, and this data is deliberately old because I'm trying to show you what I was looking at the time, if you know what I mean. That mine production was falling behind the sort of the consumption of copper. But at the same time, we were also finding plenty of new, technically these are reserves, but also resources. So like there seemed to be a problem between sort of, we're finding lots of stuff, but it's not coming on stream. So to me, there's something wrong with the way we develop projects. And I wondered at one point if this was going to be kind of like a project management, sort of type piece of work. How do we better run mine projects or something like that? And after a little bit of sort of thinking about what was going on, and sort of, it's notable that I did my work at the Centre for or do my work at the Centre for Exploration Targeting, which is obviously full of people involved in exploration, which sort of gave me that different change mindset. I started wondering if it was a different situation. So around this time, we had one of the several cancellations of the Olympic Dam open pit projects under sort of, not economic kind of decisions. There was I visited the Pebble project around 2008 or 9. In 2013-14, both Anglo-American and Rio Tinto pulled out of it, citing the environmental problems. And this is interesting because if you look at the sort of the resource data, Olympic Dam is the largest copper resource in the world, and Pebble is the largest undeveloped copper resource in the world. So, these are two really key projects, or mine and a project. And both of them were sort of having these economic, in one case, and sort of economic technical problems at Olympic Dam, and sort of this sort of environmental, social type problems at Pebble. And it seems an obvious conclusion, but not all resources can be developed economically, and not all can be developed sustainably. And what I began to realize is that I was wondering if we were really more discovery constrained than development constrained, in that we were finding the wrong projects in the first place. We weren't finding projects that could be easily developed. We weren't finding projects that were economic. We weren't finding projects that were sustainable. So that sort of changed my mindset a little bit. And there was sort of some research being done. It's not a widely researched topic, but there was certainly some data out. So I now work for Minex Consulting, just as a disclosure there, but this is some of Minex's data that does show this, that typically the resource base, or the copper mine project resource base, is of lower quality than the currently existing mine. So that sort of feeds into this argument that things aren't as economic. And then this is a sort of a paper from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, very highly respected journal. And it was looking at the number of sort of socio-political problems and conflicts around mine projects, and how they are actually real sort of economic damage in a sense. And the authors, through some sort of thumbsuck mathematics, were sort of coming up with numbers of billions of dollars. So there was, there clearly is problems with the in these cases the copper project pipeline, but it actually applies wider to pretty much all commodities. Having identified the problem, spending this time with explorers also sort of started to point towards a solution as well. So it is actually possible to find better quality projects. We don't have to assume that what we find in the future is going to be of lower quality. There is a kind of data example of this, which is the Grasberg-Escondida effect, which when those two mines, Grasberg come on stream much earlier, but when those two mines come on stream in real great volumes in the 90s, it did actually impact the overall sort of average grade of copper being produced around the world. So just two mines could alter, such high quality could alter the whole global average. So that sort of tells you that you can find things that are better. And the sort of amongst explorers, the sort of predominant theory for how this is done is the search-based theory, which is that whilst in any given area you will find the better deposits first, and therefore it becomes a game of sort of diminishing returns. If you move into a different area, you sort of replenish you sort of not quite go back to the beginning, but you sort of replenish the quality, have good quality projects again, and then you sort of go into that game of diminishing returns. And we know this intuitively. That's why anytime there's a new sort of exploration range that opens up, if it's sort of Fraser Range in WA or something like that, you get a rush of people going in because they know the better discoveries are yet to be made, sort of made quickly and early in theory. So that's what this diagram of Chile is sort of showing, this idea of different search spaces. So you have the big major discoveries at surface in the end of the 19th, beginning 20th century. And then you had the discoveries that were sort of made slightly undercover, sort of there is evidence at surface, but not direct mineralization, and then the required new technologies, and then you're starting to go into the undercover, fully undercover and blind deposits. So you do get these different search spaces. So even in the same geographical area, you have kind of multiple search spaces which allow you to replenish the exploration. So I then come up with a sort of nice little framework that have. I think this has been used in some other people's reports that uncover and things like this. But basically, what defines you know, a good quality resource? What is something that's likely to become a mine? It's something, it's, again, to state the obvious, it's something that you can discover, that's accessible, and that's economic. You know, relatively straightforward, but that's the sort of framework you're looking for. Easier said than done. And in this case, I've used the concept of accessibility to sort of, as a broad word to describe how, you know, you can be blocked due to environmental reasons, you can be blocked due to social reasons, you can be blocked due to political reasons. There's a whole number of reasons why you can be sort of stopped from developing a project by sort of society and government. So I've used the term accessibility to sort of cover that whole kind of massive sort of issue. And that all seemed kind of really sort of simple, and it's like say nice simple framework. All you need to do is collect the data and sort of get on with the work. But I sort of forgot a few things. One is I forgot how complex the future is, and sort of trying to project things forwards, how difficult that is. So the chart on the left shows the share of global copper mine production by the sort of the main countries in sort of 25-year segments. And you can sort of see in black there in the 19th century, the United Kingdom was the main copper producer in the world. It's Paul Dark's actually late 1700s into the early 1800s, but it's that sort of style of small underground mines, pickaxes and dynamite and things like that. As you went through the 19th century, first in Chile, then in the US, you started to get the bulk underground copper mines. But the really big sort of change in our industry was just at the beginning of the 20th century, with the invention of large-scale open pit mining. Again, first in the USA, and then sort of later in Chile. And Chile's now, the Chilean open pits are now the dominant copper producer. This is one of these things that seems obvious when you look back on it, but trying to put yourself in the position of essentially one of us, right, a minerals industry professional at the time, it's quite difficult. So taken this quote from Martin Lynch's History of Mining book, talking about how in 1898, you know, geologists such as ourselves were seeing sort of Bingham Canyon as a bit of a joke, you know, barren quartz, little flecks of copper, there's no copper veins, that kind of thing. The Guggenheims, who dominated copper production at the time in both Chile and the US, you know, said no to investment in it. It was, you know, ridiculed in the journals by the academics, things like this. So nobody really believed in this kind of thing. Yet 8 years later, it started up as a mine and rapidly became the world's largest copper mine. So even, you know, sort of seeing that situation is really quite difficult. And I have sympathy. If you look at the sort of words on the other side of the slide, the ones in blue are the sort of cluster of events that allowed mines like Bingham Canyon to occur, to switch from sort of large-scale underground mining to large-scale open pit mining. So there are technological things, obviously the general sort of mechanization and steam power, dynamite and things like this, and better explosives that sort of came with the Industrial Revolution helped. You know, it's kind of obvious how. Things like improved smelting and refining was kind of interesting. It's not kind of the story you think it is. What was actually going on there was that most of the smelting was still done in the UK, and the smelters got really, really efficient due to sort of technological advance, and needed more and more. They just wanted more and more ore. So they started to become willing to sort of import ore from abroad, from the US and from Chile, to sort of feed their smelters. And this interestingly sort of coincided with the invention of more rapid sort of deployment of things like free trade, where UK government policy allowed sort of the destruction of our own copper mining industry to support our smelting industry's sort of import of these foreign, the sort of foreign ores. And that's a big change on the kind of like mercantilist style politics you had. To facilitate this sort of free trade thing, you also needed financial inventions like the invention of forward contracts. The London Metals Exchange was set up for this reason. The reason there is a 3-month copper contract is because that's how long it used to take to get a ship from Antofagasta to Swansea, to get the copper ore and concentrates to Swansea. So you needed innovations like that. You also needed the innovations like the invention of the corporation, big capital to fund these projects, you know, like the Guggenheim's being one obvious one. Obviously, you have the new geographies as well, the opening up of, well, the New World, which we know is the Americas, as even things like what was going, you know, America itself was changing, right? So Bingham Canyon's riding them to sort of the middle of America, so to speak. So you needed, you know, it was no longer a frontier country. It was, you know, they were starting to build the railroads, power infrastructure, and things like this. So you needed all of these things to come into place to make something like Bingham Canyon work. So I'm kind of not surprised that the average mining engineer couldn't see all that. And the ones in red, sort of, they're the, you know, a later sort of 20th century kind of cluster of events that are saying they occurred that perhaps we didn't see just how big the Chilean industry was going to get, kind of thing. So yeah, the future's complex. And again, although I was working in copper, I was starting to see in other commodities as well. These are some slides showing the growth in size of the aluminium market compared to the copper market over the 20th century. The little orange, tiny little bit at the bottom is the growth of the copper industry compared to the growth of the aluminium industry. We sometimes describe the 20th century as the sort of the age of oil, and that's fair enough. But if you had to pick one for sort of a metal, it would be the age of aluminium, in my opinion. It totally sort of transformed as an industry. And again, it went from being a precious metal in the 19th century that was, you know, used by royal families and things like that. It's on top of the Washington Monument in the US, because when that was built at the time, being able to refine aluminium was, you know, the height of technological sophistication that a sort of new nation would want to show how amazing it is. And similar stories for nickel and uranium as well. So we do get these sort of, these massive changes do occur, and they don't seem to happen forever, and then they suddenly seem to happen. A lot of this is, those of you familiar with exponential growth, that's essentially what happens due to it. So these were the sort of, and then into my little framework, I need to think, well, how do I sort of factor in all this kind of uncertainty around the future? So going back to drawing my little models and squares, I thought, well, it's simple. All I need to do is come up with different ideas for that sort of final little cube. And then that's simple. So, you know, come up with some different ideas for the future, do the maths, and I'll be able to work out what these different resources are in the future, give us a few different options, and we'll all be okay. So that's what I came up with. I was just going to calculate which part of the existing copper resource was economic, which bits were sort of socially and environmentally sustainable, and then sort of play around with a few future parameters using scenario planning and see what would work in the future and what not. This all seemed really simple. However, it wasn't that wasn't the case at all. Firstly, the data doesn't exist in a lot of these cases. It's really difficult to analyze. It's time consuming. Ironically, some other people were trying this as well, and there's a sort of primacy on originality in PhD research. The maths was really complex, and like most geologists, I'm not a mathematician, otherwise I'd be a geophysicist. And it was just becoming a really huge job. This was, you know, multiple people's PhDs, not just one. And kind of worst of all, I was still looking at mine projects, sort of, which, if you think of them, they're kind of ideas of the past, right? They're the projects we've found that we've not developed. So they're kind of like the failed ideas of the past. So analyzing them to try and find the solution of the future is almost sort of the wrong thing to be doing. So I was trying to get, well, how do I get into this sort of analyzing the future rather than the past kind of thing? So I came up with another plan, which trying to answer these three questions, but was to basically show a quick way of that the copper project pipeline wasn't that great, to sort of prove my kind of like initial hypothesis, and then try to come up with some new ideas for exploration, much simpler kind of concepts. Unfortunately, scenario planning was ideal for both of these, so it didn't change the methodology too much, which was good because I paid to do a course that was like $10,000 or something like that at Oxford in the UK to do this. So it would have been a real shame if I flew across the world, spent an enormous amount of money, and then didn't use the technique. So these are the first scenarios that I developed. I've now called them the Game of Thrones scenarios because all scenarios should have a cool name to do with culture and things like that. So what I was sort of developed these scenarios, and basically I was looking at sort of two sort of parameters. One is how well we optimize everything we have in the current industry, and how well we optimize mines. Are we getting more and more efficient or less and less efficient? And kind of the same with innovation. Is our innovation making us more efficient or not so much? And the same with exploration. Are we getting more efficient at exploration or are we not? So it's about extracting that rent, so to speak. How good are we at sort of getting that as much as possible out? And then the other was a sort of axis of opportunity, which is how good are we at sort of, in an exploration sense, finding new search spaces, opening up new places to explore. In an innovation sense, how good are we at coming up with totally new technologies and ideas and innovations and models? How good are we at bringing on new mines? How good are we at bringing on different types of mine expansions and like so it's all this sort of, one is, how good are we at creating a new, and then there is how good are we extracting value out of what we have. And that sort of kind of gave four different scenarios, which are named after Game of Thrones characters, and did actually write two whole online articles about this. But the general concept of it was then to sort of test these scenarios against a well-known, the largest copper mines, to see which worked and which didn't in the different scenarios. So in some scenarios there was sort of environmental and social change, in some there wasn't, in some there was rapid technological development, and in some there wasn't, in sort of which the standard mine project sort of mines work in each of these different scenarios. You can read the paper if you want to know why each one got a tick or a cross, but the general thing to notice is that there is nothing that gets ticks or a cross, right? Everything is a bit of a bet on one type of future or another. And it's the same thing for sort of major copper projects, except that even fewer of them kind of work in any future. And that's why they're undeveloped projects and not mines to a certain extent. Some of them may become mines in the future, and in fact Ayatollah obviously is now, but these are a more strained concept anyway. So it's sort of, what was the conclusion of all this? Well, then what I sort of tried to create a classification scheme, which is very Australian sounding, which is a sort of no worries type asset, which is, it's something that works in every future. Then there are two other types. One is a sort of a big bet asset, which is something that works really, really well, but only one or two types of futures. So is a bet on that future. There are some things that are a bit more sort of wait and see, or an option. It's not, you need more information, more time to see how they're going to develop. And there are obviously bad assets, which are bad in any future. And to state the obvious, you don't invest in the bad assets. In general, the no worries assets don't exist, because if they did exist, there'd already be a mine, essentially. So you're kind of left with these wait and see and big bet assets. And this is essentially what our industry does. All major mining companies' corporate strategy is basically summarized by this equation, which is a few things that you're waiting to see how they evolve, a few bets on different ideas, and you mix them together and you get a corporate portfolio of good assets that, you know, doesn't have too many problems. And everybody seemed to think this was a really good piece of research. I got an award. It's sat in my office somewhere over there. And the paper was recommended for boards and investors deciding in which mine projects to invest, won an award at the university. But it's actually not that good a piece of work, in my opinion. It's pretty standard consultancy stuff. The model on the previous page and taken from a McKinsey paper, just to underline how consultant it was. It was a very safe analysis. It's the sort of thing that will never get you fired. Again, had this problem that it was all based on data and evidence, which by its definition is based on past trends and historic data. So it's not forward-looking. And it was, whilst it was very logical, it wasn't very imaginative, and that was kind of what I was going for. And kind of worst of all, it didn't really solve the problem, because the equation is probably better summarized as this, which is a couple of, you know, one bad idea and another bad idea doesn't equal a good idea. It just equals a bad idea. And that's kind of the problem with the sort of portfolio selection approach. You can't mix loads of bad ideas to make a good idea. So I was starting to think, well, what would be something a little bit more original? What would this sort of no worries strategy be that's a bit different to sort of analyzing parameters of mine projects? And I began to realize that I was analyzing the wrong thing. I was looking at sort of the mine projects, and because by their very nature, they're known. And that means that they're very well analyzed, researched, a lot is known about them, a lot of models have been done on, they're sort of very well optimized. And what I wanted to do is look at things that are kind of in the unknown. And by definition, there's no data, there's no evidence, there is nothing there. So the research kind of switched then onto the explorers themselves in a way, which is how do you find and see things in the unknown? So to rephrase the question, it became something more like, can explorers find significant better quality mineral deposits that are both economically viable and more in line with contemporary and likely future demands on the mining industry? So it sort of became much more on the explorer rather than the project. So unfortunately for some people, I'm not going to be able to tell you that the next great discovery is in, you know, this place in X, you know, down the road from Y, because that's, you know, knowledge, data, evidence-based. What I want to sort of tell you is these are the sorts of people, the sorts of thoughts, the sorts of teams, the sorts of companies, and the sorts of processes that will have a better chance of finding those things. But to do this, I sort of realized there's a sort of classic thing in sort of scenario sort of theory, which is that they call it upframing, which is that I need you to make the problem bigger. So you're pretty much told in everything in life to make the problem smaller, to focus in on solvable parts. It's the whole paradigm of a lot of academic scientific research. But if you want to solve tough problems that involve lots of different views and perspectives, you need to make it bigger so that it interests a wider range of people so that they get involved in it. So that's the quote from Dwight Eisenhower. The cherry tree is the sort of relates to the scenarios theory, a paper written by Pierre Vac, who is the scenario theorist at Shell, and was big into sort of Japanese and Eastern culture. And he talks about how a scenario needs to be on the level above the level you're analyzing. So if you want to know about leaves, you need to look at twigs. If you want to know about twigs, you look at branches. If you want to know about branches, you look at the trunk. If you want to know about the trunk, you look at the whole tree, kind of thing. So the same with the scenarios. If you want to do future scenarios on a mine project, you need to do it at maybe a country level. If you want to do scenarios for a country, you're probably looking at sort of either a continent or a global level. Similarly, if you want to look at a company, you need to analyze the industry. If you want to analyze an industry, you're probably looking at the whole world economy kind of thing. So you're always analyzing the level above. And the other thing that is I liked about scenarios is I found this is the sort of classic quote from Isaac Newton, and he's talking about sort of how his work was sort of, he's just playing with pebbles on the beach when the whole ocean is sort of left undiscovered. And there is a theory of sort of working on the fringes, which is that sort of knowledge evolves on the fringes, not in the center. We clarify and concentrate knowledge in the core, but sort of on the edges is where it's where all the crazy stuff happens. And some of it, a lot of it is rubbish, and some of it is kind of the really exciting new stuff. Scenarios, the idea of them is that they're supposed to be working on the fringes. That's why a lot of the time people don't like them initially. It's because you're in the fringe and you're uncomfortable with it. And yeah, it probably will be rubbish, but sometimes it has a gem in it. And that's kind of the nature of the sort of this explorative process. The other thing that it's obviously quite good for is as well is if you're dealing with a lot of social dimensions, they allow you to have lots of different people's perspectives in. It's a very sort of deliberate process for doing that, and whole, the classic F. Scott Fitzgerald quote. It also fits into the hedgehog and the fox type paradigm, which Nate Silver, Philip Tetlock, the sort of current sort of leading researchers in sort of forecasting are saying, which is that it goes back to the sort of an ancient Greek poem, which is that sort of a hedgehog knows one really great thing, but a fox knows several quite good things. So, a hedgehog has its really cool method of defense, and it uses it every time. Unfortunately, also including when a massive car is coming at it, and that's when the sort of the frailty of the system's shown. Whereas the fox, the scourge of the of Australian wildlife, is, it's extremely adaptable. That's why it's been such a scourge. It's happy in towns, it's happy in the countryside, it's happy in England, it's happy in Australia. It's an extremely adaptable creature. And the idea is that you need these sort of what they call foxy thinkers, people who know bits about lots of different things rather than people who know a lot about something. So they fit into that kind of model. I saw this in Peter Beck's presentation last week, and I thought, oh, that's brilliant. That's exactly what I need, which was this diagram. And he was talking about how his work is multidisciplinary and how geology is naturally multidisciplinary. The scenarios work I was doing is interdisciplinary. It had people from lots of different disciplines. And ideally, I was getting a little bit into transdisciplinary, which is where it's the stakeholder approach, essentially. So it's not just high-level academics and CEOs and the people at Davos and whatever doing them. It's kind of like everyone involved, whether you have a PhD or a degree or indeed any schooling at all, and whether you're sort of 10 years old or 80 years old or whatever, right? That's the sort of nature of transdisciplinary research. It's extremely difficult to do because of that. So I had elements of that was really more interdisciplinary. I don't expect you to really examine this, but the actual scenarios process, it's, it's your classic strategy stuff. There's a sort of process, it's the whole pen, paper, sticky notes, teams of people, all this kind of stuff. And what I did as well, I developed sort of 4 sets of scenarios. I've already shown you the first set, and then we sort of, each group sort of folded them into the next set. So I actually ended up producing 4 sets of scenarios rather than one sort of glamorous sort of end product of scenarios. And this really was, the way to think about this is kind of like, it was like my data for my PhD. This was like the experiment that I ran. And then my research began. Once everybody in these workshops had told me what to research, I then began to research it. So that was kind of the approach. I'll just sort of do a brief bit of what each of these scenarios kind of covered. I think we probably should also make clear in this work that although there was lots of people involved in these scenarios, the stuff I'm presenting is really my interpretation and view of it. So, and by their very nature, some of the people in the scenarios workshops will disagree with my interpretation of the scenarios, because the whole point of having the scenarios is that there's lots of different views. So it's not about creating a consensus, it's kind of about creating lots of different views. But anyway, these are how I've interpreted them. So the first set of scenarios are called novel, because they're sort of based on novels, you'll see. And this really talks about the new metals thing. So these scenario workshops was doing 2016. And even back then, this was the sort of, we all know about, you know, green tech and lithium and stuff now, but, you know, in 2016, this was kind of exciting. And we created this kind of, the scenario set looks like this, which is sort of, we have the world that we live in now, with our economic cycles of boom and bust, and it's sort of, Discworld is the comparison that's used of it, which is, you know, it's a world that sort of has some sort of science and knowledge, and also a kind of world where some things are a little bit mysterious and not well understood. And then there's this sort of transition, which, you know, became the energy transition. So we used, you know, the wardrobe from The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. And then you got sort of two scenarios, that one is Wonderland, after Alice in Wonderland, and one is 1984, George Orwell's book. And the Wonderland scenario was really that kind of like sustainability utopia, technology and innovation and sustainability kind of utopia. And the 1984 one, well, to be honest, a bit like the book, it was sort of the world dividing apart, and that sort of being the dominant factor in what was going on, and in each of these different parts of the world addressing the energy transition in different ways to greater or lesser success. So, you know, Wonderland, you know, all the things you would expect in it. It's your tech disruption and innovation, Silicon Valley, Tesla type world, and global trade deals and Paris agreements and things like that. But it's also kind of quite a volatile world. There is an undercurrent to this. Like Alice in Wonderland is a dystopian novel. It's not a utopian novel, which is that it's a very disruptive world to live in. It's always changing. You're always being, you know, disrupted. There's always events occurring. You know, it's living on the frontier, living on the edge. It's actually quite tough. And then the 1984 scenario, again, it's kind of what you expect. It's, you know, at the time, again, it's 2016, it's sort of ISIS and Putin and Trump and Brexit and all these kind of things. It's funny, I mean, literally while we were doing these workshops, the Brexit referendum occurred. So that was obviously in everyone's mind. Trump had been nominated as the Republican candidate. Obviously the election hadn't occurred, but, you know, so these things very much on people's mind. They very much fed into the zeitgeist, or whatever you would call it. And, you know, things, protectionism and all these kind of things are sort of what you would expect with this. But also kind of, it makes it sound like quite a tough world, but it's also kind of an interesting thing from a sort of mining and exploration point of view. It can be quite good for us, because if you sort of read 1984, as long as you kind of keep your mouth shut, actually, you know, the engineers and scientists are quite well respected. It's kind of like how it was in the Soviet Union, I guess, which is that, you know, you're the people that go out and find resources for the war machine that protects the nation, right? So you're actually in kind of a valuable, almost sort of civil service type role, right? So it's kind of interesting that, you know, there's sort of different currents to each of the scenarios. There's never really a good and a bad one, so to speak. And the other thing that's kind of interesting about them is that they're, going back to our nice Kurt Vonnegut storylines, is they're kind of about voluntary and forced change. So in the Wonderland scenario, it was like, you know, society and technologists and Silicon Valley drove us into this sort of magic new future. We solved all that, you know, we brought out loads of renewable energy and new batteries and new car, you know, electric cars, all the things that were, you know, with geoengineering and blocking out the sun, all these kind of things that sort of got us into the future. We sort of did it as one sort of great inspirational move forward. Whereas the 1984 scenario, essentially, some parts of the world, sort of quite a European bloc, were essentially forced through the energy transition because they had that oil supplies cut off. It was actually kind of a 1970s type scenario in a weird way. And some parts of the world didn't progress at all because they had sort of neither oil nor the ability to sort of take on advanced new renewable technologies and things like this. So, but the key sort of thing to remember is that you needed this sort of crisis of sort of war and supplies being cut off to actually make the change. And this is where I go back to sort of all those geo novels, which is that it appears to be common to Western culture, is that we need a crisis to move forward. I mean, there's I can't remember which politician is. I think it might be Clinton. Is the never waste a good crisis kind of thing. It just we almost need that to move us forward. Whereas the idea that is sort of sometimes said to be a more of an Eastern culture concept is that it's more of a creation story thing. You never have the crisis. It's always a sort of progress upwards. And this is also what Silicon Valley is usually selling you when they're talking about stock prices. They only ever go upwards, right? They're never going to go down. So this is that kind of evangelic kind of approach as well. There are problems with that approach in that it means that people in the West, we sort of embrace problems probably too much to a certain extent, in that we almost go out looking to create a problem to get the solution. Whereas it would seem sometimes, I think certainly in the business world that happens in Eastern cultures, is that actually you have to deny there's a problem in the first place. So it's kind of interesting how these sort of the different ways we can go about change is what these scenarios sort of became about. And they also sort of opened up a nice little subtlety on when I was talking about accessibility and how there's kind of two things going on, and we often mix them up quite a lot. And I'd mix them up with this sort of one definition of accessibility, which is there are sociopolitical restrictions and geopolitical restrictions. So sociopolitical ones are when local groups stop you developing a project, or people don't like a commodity for the environmental damage it does. Uranium would be the classic example, right? Or don't like a mining technique, open pit mining, because it damages the surface kind of thing. So those are sort of the socio-political restrictions. And then there are kind of geopolitical restrictions, which is where sort of the movements of global politics and national level politics stops us getting access to projects. So from a Western perspective, we can't develop projects in China and Russia. And as a quid pro quo almost, Russians and Chinese are finding it increasingly difficult to develop projects anywhere else in the world as well. So that's what's stopping you getting access to those projects. It's not that the local people are protesting, it's not an environmental reason, it's not socio-political, it's more geopolitical. And that's kind of worth pulling out, as they're two separate issues, and sometimes one is on when the other is off. Sometimes they're both on and sometimes they're both off. Is kind of so there's a sort of nuance that was worth thinking about. So that was those scenarios. The next sort of scenarios are were sort of a Star Wars versus Star Trek theme, and they look more at the sociopolitics. So it's quite a simple sort of two set of scenarios. One is sort of trapped in a cycle, and one is sort of breaking a cycle. And I use sort of Star Wars and Star Trek as the metaphor. So Star Wars it's a world in which all that is known exists, and it's a fight over what is there. It's a very constrained mindset. It's the prisoner's dilemma type mindset. So it's all about how much you can take off someone else. And the result of all of these taking type situations are that you take something and then they take it off you, and then vice versa, and vice versa, and vice versa, right? And you're just trapped in that kind of cycle of taking. Whereas the kind of Star Trek had this, and there's no surprise that it's San Francisco based kind of franchise, of the sort of breaking the cycle of going to the last frontier of creating that ever increasing world, right? This is the way you break the prisoner's dilemma, is you get people to give up fighting for now to have a larger share of the future. And that's kind of why economic growth is so massively important in our society, is that as long as you have economic growth, you can convince people that there is something more in the future for them if they cooperate now. The moment you lose the argument, you lose the belief that there's something there in the future, everyone starts fighting over what's left. So that's the kind of Star Wars, Star Trek type paradigm. This was also when I should really credit my supervisor, Alan Trench, for coming up with this idea, saw something really interesting in health and safety and how you get to the Star Trek kind of scenario, right? It's like, how do you break the cycle? And it's switching, again, it's the mentality switch of switching from seeing things as a constraint to seeing things as kind of an opportunity. And so what happened with health and safety culture, initially, 19th century kind of approach is very, very compliance based. And then you get into the 20th century, very tick box based. It was a set of constraints and rules that stopped you from doing what you wanted from the perspective of mine managers. Whereas in the 1970s, it was broadly mid 20th century. There was a sort of, particularly it seems amongst the sort of the mining engineering fraternity and the mine managing fraternity, to sort of get into this health and safety culture thing, and people were just essentially sick of pulling bodies out of mines who were their mates. And somebody I know always talks about like the shock when the fifth member of your five-a-side team doesn't turn up on a Monday. And it's like, this has got to change, right? And the change then started to come, not necessarily from the bottom, I would say more from kind of the middle. And it became much more about sort of having a health and safety culture, and that actually ticking boxes often was counterproductive. It's about having everybody thinking and engaged in this. And to a certain extent, we've now almost got into kind of like a health and safety excellence type mentality among some companies. So DuPont, which famously had the massive disaster at Bhopal, is now sort of a leading seller of health and safety training courses. It's kind of like the best practice guideline in a weird way. It's sort of it's become, it's sort of taken the problem and benefited from it. You would argue a little bit around Exxon as well, with the Exxon Valdez, that's been argued as well. And we now sort of see how there's a clear alignment between sort of good health and safety culture actually helps with productivity, because it shows an organization that knows how to run things, and it also shows an organization that it's an organization people want to work for and the best people want to work for. So it completely flips the situation on its head from being a constraint to kind of like a real opportunity and something to exceed in. And I wondered if maybe that's where we can sort of go with this kind of social license concept, is that rather than seeing all these things as a constraint that's stopping us developing projects, and turning it into something actually, if you can do this, you have an opportunity that other people don't, if you know what I mean. There's something that you can do that your competitors can't, and that's a real opportunity. So that was kind of an interesting sort of insight. The other thing that came out of these scenarios is they were very, very technological. They were the most technological of the scenarios. And again, this sort of seems a little bit kind of obvious now, but we were sort of in the grip at the time of the sort of the drones and the big data centers, and Rio Tinto had just got their kind of big remote hub thing going in Perth. And whilst all this sort of like technological utopianism was going on, all I was picking up from the people in the scenarios workshop, half of which were from the mining, three-quarters of which from mining exploration, was this kind of problem, which is that drones are military technology used for spying on people and killing them. Big data is military technology used for spying on people. A remote operations center is literally the remote lair that Bond villains have. And artificial intelligence is the stuff of dystopian film. So it was no surprise to me when all this kind of techlash kind of thing started coming up. And it now sort of seems obvious, but at the time it was sort of like, what are we doing with this technology? We're sort of not thinking about the social side of it. And one area that particularly struck me was in remote exploration, in that the idea of taking geologists out of the field seems really, really popular, but it's also really destructive for local engagement, which is one of our biggest problems in the industry as well. It was this sort of framework was created after I had someone from CSIRO present on future technology, and then someone an anthropologist who works in indigenous title negotiation speak just after, and basically say, oh no, don't take the geologists out of the field. They're the ones that the indigenous people get on with, right? They have a shared love of wandering around and looking at rocks in the sky. All the problems start when the CEO turns up. So it's that sort of, geologists do more than geology in the field in a way. And so we've got to sort of think about our kind of, we can't fully explore remotely. If you go into the sort of social theory type theory, people talk about sort of digital colonization and aerial colonization and things like that, which are probably things we don't want to be getting involved in. So that sort of, it was kind of an interesting insight. And what was also going on at the time, and this was unfortunate for UWA, is they just launched a data science degree. And there was a lot of discussion around how we're not going to need geologists in the future. What we need is data scientists who can look at all the data and do cool things. And the skill set perfectly lines up with this kind of remote sort of attack of the drones type scenario, right? People, in our case, sort of sat in Perth, flying drones and around and collecting data and basically causing problems in the field. So that it sort of, whereas the sort of skill set that is sort of least valued is the field geology one, right? Which aligns with, you know, it's called Last Jedi, right? You know, because obviously I'm a geologist and we get to be Jedi Knights. Is, you know, the thing that's seen as expensive and not required actually could be a sort of, actually a really, really valuable thing. One of those things where you're not seeing the full externalities of its value. So, you know, there's this whole technology and social impact kind of thing that came out of the scenarios that I thought was quite interesting. There was also a lot of discussion about technology itself and innovation, right? There's, you know, I'm sure I'm not the first sort of person to come on one of these talks and talk about innovation, but there is a good reason why I'm quite pessimistic about innovation in mining sometimes, which is that we are sustaining in our innovation, we're sustainers. So we do something which is bigger, 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 and then we automate it, right? That's the sum of our massive innovation over the last couple of decades. And even in comparison to the oil industry, which is just another resources industry, so you wouldn't expect to be too innovative, they've actually, over the 20th century, fundamentally changed how they take stuff out of the ground several different times. So way back in the 1900s, obviously you've got your nodding donkeys, and these are still used in various places, but they've also, you know, these offshore, you know, worked out how to go offshore, a whole new kind of way of extracting oil. Obviously you've got the shale gas kind of fracking type thing as well. And you can even mine for oil in the tar sands, right? So there's like, and these are fundamentally different ways of getting out of the ground. They're totally different. So they seem to be a little bit more kind of innovative in that sense. And that's just the oil industry. It's not an innovative industry, so to speak. In reading an old book from 1986, I found this great quote from R.V. Parbo, who used to be the chairman of BHP, obviously made this quote in about 1986. And his view of the future of mining was, you know, robotized machinery, in situ leaching, with some, you know, bio in situ leaching kind of thing. And it's all going to, you know, it's all going to be sort of geochemistry, and we're going to get rid of crushing and stuff like this. If you look at what CSIRO's current view of the future of mining is, it's this. But this was written, you know, 40 years ago, right? Why has our view of the future not changed in 40 years? Like, has nothing interesting and inspiring happened in sort of technology innovation? It's kind of, I wonder. This is just a McKinsey, or actually Harvard Business Review, based on a McKinsey report that shows, I think, what we kind of know, which is that the mining industry is sort of digitally behind, so to speak. Again, sort of, this is my sort of really skeptical view of our current sort of current technology suite of kind of the most advanced things we have in exploration and mining. And these are all pictures from, the first picture may even be from Diri Metallica, but I think it's actually a 19th century book on remote mining. And what this shows is a mine in Cornwall in the 19th century. in which remote mining is occurring, where a man sits in a cabin a safe distance away and operates the mechanical machinery, which extracts the stuff out of the mine. So we've been doing that for a couple of 100 years. Drones, the great thing about drones is they allow you to see things from above. It's a picture of Charles Lyell in, I don't know, 1830 or 1840. And what he's done is he's stood on top of a cliff, and that allows him to see things from above. So we've been able to do that for, well, 200 years and probably much longer. This is a driverless truck from the early 20th century. What you do is if you build it on an incline, it goes by itself. So we've had driverless trucks for 100 years. And this is big data from the West Australian goldfields, so 1890s, which is, definition of big data is passively generated large-scale real-time data. Well, this is passively generated large-scale real-time data. So we've had that for a long time. So none of what we're doing is fundamentally changing things in a radical way. It's all sustaining technology in one way or another. And this is, again, a bit the scenarios type stuff is the innovators, we work in the incremental and occasionally the proximal. How do you get to this radical edge, the fringe of knowledge? And that's sort of one of the uses of scenarios. It's also this kind of area which sort of the futurists work in, which is you have to kind of get back to principles. So instead of saying, how do we design a better truck? You have to sort of say, well, like, how do we do mining better? Or how do we do mining without mining? You have to go really step back the principles, and you start looking at, okay, what's going on in sort of science and technology and innovation. These are the big moving ones at the moment. Nanotechnology has dropped off a little bit, but certainly brain science, be it neurology or psychology, AI, they're the big kind of moving ones at the moment. Biotechnology, genetics as well. We sort of initially think that surely they're not going to affect mining and exploration. I've grayed out computer science because we know that one, but surely those are not going to affect it. If I sort of had to bet for the really, really radical stuff, it's probably more likely that will come out of that than they will coming out of sort of sustaining innovation around digitization. This is one of these, it's from the Imperial Foresight Center, and they sort of map out crazy technologies going out sort of 10, 20, 30 years into the future. And the interesting stuff about this is it sounds like sometimes some of the things are really weird and radical, but they're only looking sort of at most 20 years out. And it's, again, that problem of we're not on top of every technological change occurring in sort of every different field. And that makes trying to see the whole picture really difficult. Something like AI in GP surgeries is basically already here. So the final set of scenarios I worked on started looking at this geopolitical search space, and these are going a more sort of Dickensian type theme. I was actually doing them at Christmas, so they're based on a Christmas Story with Scrooge and Marley and stuff. And they actually map out sort of our politics. And so instead of it being that local social license stuff, it's that kind of grander geopolitics type stuff. And you can almost sort of map what has happened in over the last sort of 200 years of our political history that the mining industry sort of had to react to using this kind of framework, which has this sort of progressive versus conservative values, and then sort of protectionist versus globalist kind of economic perspective on the world, right? And they've all got nice little character names. So if you go back to back to high school for a lot of us, and certainly back to high school in England for me, if you go back to the sort of 19th century Victorian politics, the right wing, everyone was a capitalist, Lord, and you either sort of right wing country orientated, or you were Whiggish and city orientated, right? There was no sort of nothing on this side, and that's because the franchise was only for 5% of people. Obviously, as things evolved, you then got sort of everyone became, a free trading, in belief in free trade and global expansion and empire and all these kind of things, and the politics was much more sort of liberal conservative. It's poor laws versus kind of let's try and do something for the poor kind of thing. But very, very paternalist still. You still ain't got a 5% franchise. Obviously, the big thing that occurred at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century was the rise of the labour movement, which sort of extended on from the concept of communism, but wasn't necessarily communist everywhere. The sort of the left went back to this sort of more protectionist kind of view. So, you got this kind of classic kind of right left wing, which is sort of free trade and liberty and free rights. And then you've got a sort of left wing type view, which was against free trade and was for local support for jobs and also extracting more from the owners of capital. So that's sort of you can argue that Ludditism in the 19th century is kind of a bit like that as well. And then as we went through the 1970s would be the classic decade for this, but really all the way through the 20th century, you also saw the labour movement align with various other movements, the Green Movement, various social movements, gay rights, feminism, etc. Indigenous issues finally being tackled. So that sort of what kind of happened is the left became a very sort of broad group of coalitions. And then as we move to sort of the very end of the 20th century, early 21st century, the left became more globalist. And, this is sort of Blair's New Labour. Clinton was a bit along this way. You would argue that Davos is the classic example of this, right? Which is all the world's great and good meeting together to sort of discuss social and economic issues. And it became really sort of, again, about sort of progressive versus conservative politics, and kind of everyone agreed on the economics. And what sort of happened in the 2010s, Brexit and Trump are really good examples of this, is we flipped from that sort of everyone believing the sort of globalist perspective to a much more localist protectionist perspective, right? So, Sanders in the US, Corbyn in the UK's classic old Labour type stuff, UKIP, Trump Republicans, Tea Party Republicans, all classic examples of this flip back to sort of looking at the world from a sort of localist perspective. And this is kind of my guess of what we're going on now. Trying to read current politics is always hard, but we essentially seem to have even harder got into the sort of almost what I've called it factionalist type world, whether it's the China versus USA issue, or whether it's sort of identity. So people talk about identity politics a lot and refer to the left, but it's really also the right as well. The identity being the white working class male. It's much more this, like, everyone's sort of splitting into different sections and things like that, and it's occurring on both sides. And that seems to be kind of where we are at the moment. So how does all of this relate to mining? The situation going on at any given time affects what is going on in your industry. So to state the obvious, it's about this time in the sort of mid to late 19th century. Actually, the first mining acts were in the early 19th century, but when people started caring about health and safety, and it was in a sort of paternalist way, and that was what this sort of shift represents. And this kind of diagram basically is your classic unions versus owners type situation, or unions versus professionals is another way of sort of describing it. And that sort of dominated a lot of what happened in our industry in these times. And obviously, with these extra movements, what has dominated our industry a lot over the last few decades is green issues, indigenous rights issues, diversity issues, all sorts of things. So these are the things that frame what is actually going on in our industry. So the argument is, at the moment, the things that are framing what's going on in our industry and will do in the near future is this kind of factionalist type stuff. And a good example of this for me is the difference between social license and sustainable development. So sustainable development is something was invented by the UN in 1987. It's very universalist, it's very top down, it's very, we will set up, smart people at the UN will set a set of principles, or smart people at Davos will set a set of principles which the whole rest of the world will follow. Whereas social license totally throws that on its head, and it's basically, well, we live next to the mine, we're the ones who get to say what goes on, and we don't care what your views are from over there. It's sort of two very, very different ways of looking at a sort of a change in social and environmental. They're both like social and environmentally progressive, but done in totally different ways. So the lesson from this is that politics is like a playground, and you have the normal back and forth of politics, and I'm generally talking about democratic politics here, which is elections, one party in and one party out, or one trend in and one trend out, or whatever. You then have roundabouts, which are these are the roundabouts, these sort of long-term, these sort of big sort of structural shifts, sort of from globalism to localism, or more progressive to less progressive. Things like that are the sort of the roundabout events, they go round slower and tend to go back to where you started. And then there are the climbing frames. In scenarios and futurist talk, you talk about predetermined elements, and these are things in the future that you will have to confront. You have to go over the climbing frame, and trying to think which in any sort of political trend or social political trend, it's worth thinking about which are the swings, which are the roundabouts, and which are the climbing frames. And in general, our industry tends to get it the wrong way around, which is that we focus on the swings and the day-to-day and election to election politics. And we generally, sometimes we pick up, but generally we miss the sort of structural underlying shifts. And we are, like a lot of people, we're really bad at going over the climbing frame and truly addressing the climbing frame. And really, from strategist perspective, we should worry about the climbing frame and the roundabout, and you can ignore the swing, because the swing swings back very quickly. And I would argue from the scenarios, there were two things, like, are they swings or are they roundabouts, or are they climbing frames? And environmentalism, in general, I would argue, is a climbing frame. There is no evidence that it is decreasing. There is no future where there is less environmentalism. There's just futures with more and less more kind of thing. And the good evidence for this, for me, comes in China, the environmentalism in the Chinese middle class, which is that there appears to be basically a curve of income where you get above a certain level of, you get out of poverty, and then your environment really starts to matter to you. And if the world is going to get wealthier and richer, that's going to, more environmentalism is going to occur. It's actually one of the few positive things about climate change, is that it actually may be an issue that people just care more and more and more and more about. And so that's I would argue that is a climbing frame. And this the other thing that's quite, and COVID has ramped this up massively, right, is this sort of anti-globalization movement. So we had a big phase of globalization. It's like, how long are we going away? Is globalization over? I would argue not. I would argue there's a swing away from it, and then it will swing back. It's a roundabout kind of thing, right? It'll come back around again. And this is because the key aspect of globalization is also this thing called globalism, which is a horrible word, but the very process of globalization strengthens local identity and rights. So everybody, because the whole world is changing, everyone suddenly becomes concerned with kind of their local identity. And the franchise, the word that's used as a downside for globalization is McDonald'sization, where everything becomes like McDonald's. But even at McDonald's, there's local subtlety, and this is the fish burger that you get in Singapore, and obviously you don't get beef burgers in India. So even a sort of global franchise, which is seen as totally monochromatic, is actually kind of like, I'm not saying it's like the height of sophistication, but it's that subtly different in every local place. So the two kind of go with each other as well. So I guess I think I'll come towards the end of talking, and we'll have a little bit of it. I'll try and link this to what's going on in our industry, and then conclude. So this is my current views on how are we handling politics in our industry. Obviously, it's quite Australian focused, because that's what I know about. the BHP think big and dropping the billiton from the name to become BHP is like classically in line with this like becoming more local kind of thing again and sort of becoming Australian. I mean, I would say it sort of needs to be backed up by actual work rather than just branding, but that's kind of very much in line with this riding the roundabout type approach. I liked this one from Sandfire Resources. In 2016, they launched, just after the Trump victory, launched Montana to get their Black View project going, which I thought was very entrepreneurial and innovative, at least. Although really they're focusing on the swing, which is the personality, not the trend, the roundabout. So if they can, the language of making Montana great and sort of working with the community in Montana is really, really good. Linking it to Trump, it was not a good idea because he was going to be voted out in 4 or 8 years, one way or another, right? So sort of they didn't quite get the focus right. For those of you who care about the WA gold royalties, this was the mining industry in WA managing to make enemies of both the Liberals, the Nationals, and Labour, and a good example of that in many ways. It was a really badly done piece of politics, which was where you just jolt from one short-term reaction to another and actually damage everything over the long term. And I mean, the less said about you can gorge, the better, but you know, clearly we did detrimental damage to local relations with that, and it's going to affect the whole industry. So we, you know, sometimes we get things quite right and sometimes we get things very wrong. And this is sort of, I think I'll sort of finish on this slide. I quite like the story, which is how do you do this kind of localist type stuff if we are going into a localist type world? It's a very different way of doing things. It's not how we've done sustainable development. And funny enough, it's not how we're doing ESG. It's not about sort of having people in the corporate office tick boxes and do programs. It's actually about sort of having your front line doing this for you, the people on the ground. And I tell this story, this is before COVID, when actually flights existed and you could, you know, go to the airport and catch a plane. It's about the time my daughter was born, and we were flying back to the UK to see our family quite a lot, to show off the baby, and you've got all of the different luggage and like baby carrier and buggy and car seats, and like you've got so much stuff. And we're at the airport and we're trying to get onto the bus that goes from the car to the airport, and the bus pulls up and it's totally jam-packed full, and you know, how are we going to get all our stuff on? And basically, it was a bunch of FIFO workers who'd just come in from their swing, all wearing their Rio Tinto high vis and sunglasses and whatever, and they basically grabbed all our stuff, put it on board. We really helped my wife up, who was carrying the baby and all this kind of stuff, and were just really nice and helpful. And sort of thinking, well, actually, that's probably a better advert for Rio Tinto than any of the adverts Rio Tinto has done for itself. And funny enough, we're traveling about again a couple of months later, and more or less the same thing happened with the Virgin Airlines staff, which is that, you know, the same situation where all the luggage occurred, extremely helpful, and that's better than any of the advertising that Virgin Airlines could have done. And it's about this sort of empowering the people, you know, who are on the front line, who are essentially the local people in this situation. And this goes back to this point about sort of geologists in the field. They have this really valuable role in this kind of thing. And if you get rid of them, who's doing that role? So that's kind of, you know, the link there with sort of like, how do we tackle this localism type issue? Well, it's actually by, you know, letting go of things and letting the people on the ground kind of do it for you, which, you know, in sort of the corporate world is a very difficult thing to envisage.
So interesting. Thank you so much.